The supply curve demonstrates the positive relationship between the price of a good or service and the quantity of that good or service that is being supplied. So if the price is low, the quantity supplied will be low. And if the price rises, let's say from P1 to P2, then the quantity supplied will also rise. Okay? And the elasticity of the supply curve tells us by how much it'll rise. Okay, so here it went from Q1 to Q2. Example number 1 asks what happens to the elasticity of the supply of physicians when the duration of medical school increases to 10 years. So the supply curve we're looking at here is the supply of physicians okay, and if the price of a physician, or you could think of it as the salary a physician gets paid, increases from P1 to P2, okay, then we expect more physicians to enter the U.S. healthcare market, driven by that higher potential salary, and so we see an increase in the quantity of physicians being supplied, in this case from Q1 to Q2. Okay. Now, if at the same time, though, the duration of medical school increases to 10 years, it's now going to be more difficult for the quantity of physicians to increase. It's going to at least take a longer time for that quantity to increase. To demonstrate the increase in the duration of medical school, we need to draw a more inelastic supply curve for physicians. In other words, a steeper supply curve, like this one. Okay, so this is going to be a more inelastic supply. Okay. To see the impact of this, suppose we start with an initial cost of a physician at P1, as we did before. So the corresponding quantity of physicians being supplied is also Q1, just as before. Okay, but the difference is in what happens when the price of a physician increases. So if the price of a physician now increases to P2, okay, now the quantity supplied will increase, but only to, let's call it Q3. Okay. So in other words, when the price of a physician, or the salary a physician gets paid, increases from P1 to P2, now the quantity supplied increases by less than it did when we had a more elastic supply of physicians. That is, before the duration of medical school increased. Example number 2 concerns the supply of medical care, which shows us a positive relationship between the quantity of medical care supplied and the price of that medical care. Okay? In other words, at a low price of medical care, let's say P1, the quantity supplied of that care is fairly low, and if the price of medical care rises to P2, then we expect to see an increase in the quantity supplied. Okay, let's say to Q2. Okay, so there's our increase in the quantity in response to an increase in the price. Okay. Now, if there is a legal change that allows nurse practitioners to do some of the work previously reserved for physicians, this introduces a lot of flexibility into the supply of medical care. In other words, now when the price of medical care increases, we'll be able to increase the supply of that medical care much more easily, perhaps more quickly. To illustrate this change, we need to draw a new supply curve, something that's going to be flatter than the existing supply curve. Okay, so here is our now more elastic supply curve. When price is low at P1, the quantity supplied is still low at Q1. The difference with this new supply curve, though, lies in what happens when the price rises from P1 to P2. Okay. Now the quantity supplied will increase just as it did with the previous supply curve, but it'll increase more strongly. Okay? So we'll go not just up to Q2, but all the way up to Q3. Okay, so with a more elastic supply curve, we see a larger quantity response to the price changes.